Have you ever found yourself carrying the weight of impossible decisions, wondering if love could survive the sacrifices you've made? Today, we take you on an emotional journey through the life of Elena, a mother who gave everything to ensure her son had a better future. But that choice came with consequences that would haunt her for years. As she watches her son grow up from afar, the distance between them seems insurmountable. Yet, deep within her heart, she clings to the hope of reconciliation, of rebuilding the bond that time and circumstance have threatened to erase. From moments of quiet tenderness to heart-wrenching pain, this story reminds us of the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. Elena's journey takes her from hope to despair and back to hope again, revealing that even in our darkest moments, the possibility of redemption is never far away. So join us as we uncover the deep emotional layers of Elena's life, where love, sacrifice, and hope intertwine in a story that will leave you reflecting long after it's over. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Beneath the fading light of an overcast sky, a fragile figure sat hunched over in the solitude of her worn-out living room. Elena, an elderly woman of 70, bore the weight of decades on her frail shoulders. Each line on her weathered face held the echoes of battles fought in silence, of sacrifices made without complaint. But on this day, an invisible shadow loomed heavier than ever, suffocating the air in her small, time-worn apartment. A knock on the door shattered the stillness, reverberating through her bones. Slowly, Elena rose to answer, her hands trembling with a mixture of dread and resignation. There stood Ricardo, the landlord, his appearance as polished and pristine as ever, a stark contrast to the tattered remains of Elena's world. His eyes, devoid of warmth, met hers with a cold, calculated stare. "Mrs. Elena," he began with a voice as sharp as a blade, "I'm here about the rent. You're a month behind." "You know the rules." Elena's heart quickened, each beat pounding against the walls of her chest. She had expected this moment, dreaded it in every waking thought, but now that it was here, the reality was suffocating. "Please, Mr. Ricardo," she whispered, her voice cracked with desperation. "My pension was delayed. Just a few more days, that's all I need." Ricardo's expression hardened, his lips pursed in a thin line of indifference. "We've been through this before," he said curtly, dismissing her plea. "A month without payment is unacceptable. You have until tomorrow to leave." His words, so final and unfeeling, slammed into her like a sledgehammer, shattering the fragile hope she had clung to. Tears threatened to spill from her weary eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to show weakness to this man who seemed to possess none of his own. "I've lived here for 15 years, she choked out, her voice trembling. "I've never missed a payment before. Can't you find it in your heart to show a little compassion?" Ricardo's gaze swept the room, disdain flickering in his eyes. "Compassion," he scoffed. "This isn't about feelings, Mrs. Elena. Rules are rules. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." And just like that, the door closed behind him, sealing her fate with an icy finality. Elena collapsed into her old armchair, the weight of her world pressing down on her chest. Her eyes fell upon a photograph on the table, a young boy, her son, his face beaming with the innocence of youth. A lump formed in her throat as she reached for a small drawer beside her, pulling out a delicate necklace. Its dull shine caught the dim light, a faint shimmer of beauty in the growing darkness of her life. Clutching the necklace tightly to her chest, Elena let the memories wash over her, memories of a time when love filled her days, when hope seemed eternal. She whispered into the emptiness, her voice thick with longing, "I promised you, my child. I'll never let this go. It's all I have left." As the hours passed and the city outside buzzed with indifference, Elena moved like a ghost through her apartment, packing what little she had. Every item she touched held a memory, a piece of a life that now felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The necklace, always close to her heart, was her last connection to a past she could never reclaim. When morning broke, Elena stood at the threshold of the only home she had known for years, the weight of her few belongings heavy in her arms. The world continued to turn, oblivious to her quiet suffering. To the city, she was just another forgotten soul, another casualty of life's unforgiving cruelty. A month later, as the streets of the city carried on in their relentless march, Ricardo found himself walking past a group of beggars huddled in the cold. His eyes skimmed over them without interest until something caught his attention. There, among the ragged figures, he saw her Elena, frail and broken, sitting on the edge of the sidewalk with an outstretched hand. But what truly stole his breath was not her condition, but the small, familiar glimmer hanging around her neck, a necklace, one he had not seen in years, one that had once belonged to his own mother. That morning, Elena rose long before the first light of dawn kissed the horizon. The world was still wrapped in the quiet shroud of night as she moved through her tiny kitchen, preparing a humble breakfast for her son. The ritual was always the same: softly waking him, dressing him in his worn school uniform, and kissing his forehead as she whispered, "Be good today, mi amor. Mama will be home soon." Her voice held a tender promise, though both knew that soon meant late in the evening, after another exhausting day of endless work. With the sun barely rising, Elena arrived at the textile factory where the air was heavy with dust, and the relentless clatter of machinery filled every corner. She worked with silent determination, her hands moving in a practiced rhythm, despite the aches that had settled into her bones long ago. She ignored the supervisor's lingering glances, those eyes that followed her like shadows, filled with hunger she refused to acknowledge. Her fellow workers, too, cast their judgment in the form of muttered insults and cruel whispers. But Elena pressed on, every fiber of her being focused on the only thing that mattered: providing a future for her son, a future far away from this. By midday, she rushed to the wealthy side of town, where manicured gardens and grand houses stood as silent reminders of what she could never afford. Here, she cleaned for Dona Mercedes, a woman whose gaze was as sharp as her words were bitter. "Elena," she snapped the moment she entered, "there was dust on the dresser yesterday. I expect everything to be immaculate today, or I'll deduct from your pay." Elena swallowed her pride and nodded, her humiliation swallowed down like a bitter pill. As she dusted, scrubbed, and polished, her mind wandered to her son. Had he eaten enough at school? Was he keeping up with his lessons? Worry gnawed at her, but there was no time to dwell. She had to keep moving. By the time afternoon arrived, Elena found herself in the bustling plaza, selling homemade empanadas under the scorching sun. The heat was merciless, each ray of sunlight a reminder of how unforgiving life could be. But Elena smiled through the sweat and fatigue, greeting every customer with warmth. Every coin she earned was carefully tucked away, another small step towards her dream of a better life for her child. She imagined a future where Ricardo wouldn't have to work as hard as she did, a future where he could live without the constant weight of struggle pressing down on his small shoulders. It was nearly dusk by the time Elena returned home, her body aching from the day's labor. The small apartment was unusually quiet, a stillness that sent a chill down her spine. "Ricardo," she called out, her voice trembling. When she found him, her heart nearly stopped. Her son was lying in bed, his face flushed, his small body racked with fever. His eyes, usually so full of life, were glassy and distant. "Mama," he whispered, his voice weak and barely audible, "I don't feel good." Fear gripped Elena's heart like a vice. She had no money for a doctor, no one to ask for help. Panic clawed at her insides as she stood there, feeling more powerless than ever. The world, which had always seemed so indifferent to her struggles, now felt like a cruel enemy. Desperation drove her thoughts to the neighborhood moneylender, Don Ramon. Everyone knew his reputation. He was a man who thrived on the misfortune of others, a man who could offer a lifeline, but at a devastating cost. Elena knew that going to him was dangerous, that the debt he would demand in return could consume her. But she had no other choice. Her son needed medicine, and she would do anything to save him. With trembling hands, she bundled Ricardito up and ventured out into the night. The streets, usually familiar, now felt ominous and foreboding. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, but Elena pushed forward, her love for her son giving her the strength she needed to face whatever lay ahead. As she walked, her fingers instinctively reached for the necklace that hung around her neck, the only keepsake she had from her own mother. It had been a source of comfort for as long as she could remember. "Give me strength," she whispered to the memory of her mother, knowing that the decision she was about to make would forever alter the course of their lives. Don Ramon's shop was as unwelcoming as she had imagined. The smell of dampness hung in the air, mingling with the desperation that seemed to cling to every surface. She stepped inside with hesitant steps, clutching the necklace like a talisman against the darkness. The moneylender greeted her with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Elena," he said, his voice oozing with a false sweetness, "what brings you to my door?" Elena swallowed her fear, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son is sick. I need money for medicine." Don Ramon's eyes roamed over her, calculating, evaluating. His gaze landed on the necklace, and a glint of interest sparked in his eyes. That necklace, he mused, would make a fine deposit. Elena's heart clenched. "Not the necklace," she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "I'll work more hours. I'll do whatever it takes." After a tense negotiation, Elena walked out of the shop with the money in hand, but the weight of the debt she had incurred pressed down on her like a stone. She hurried to the pharmacy, arriving just before they closed, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She bought the medicine and rushed back home, every second feeling like an eternity. When she returned, her son was still tossing and turning in his feverish sleep. With gentle hands, she administered the medicine, her fingers stroking his damp forehead as she whispered soothing words. "You'll get better, my love," she murmured, though the fear in her heart told her otherwise. But for her son's sake, and for her own, she clung to that fragile hope, praying that this nightmare would soon pass. The dawn brought no comfort to Elena that morning as she dragged herself out of bed, the heavy circles under her eyes a testament to another sleepless night. Her heart pounded with fatigue, but there was no time to rest. She had responsibilities her son needed her, and the weight of their precarious situation hung over her like a cloud. As she made her way to the factory, every step felt heavier than the last. When she arrived, the familiar clamor of machines did little to ease her nerves. The exhaustion that clung to her bones made the hours feel endless. In the quiet, dimly lit hallway of the factory, Elena was intercepted by Don Carlos, the supervisor. His presence, as always, was unsettling, and she could feel his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Elena, Elena," he drawled, stepping closer, invading her personal space with an unnerving grin. "You look so tired. Why don't you come to my office? We could have a little talk about a raise. You work so hard, don't you think you deserve a reward?" Elena's stomach twisted with disgust. She took a step back, trying to create distance between them, but the hallway felt suffocating, like there was no escape. "No, thank you, Don Carlos," she replied, her voice steady but her insides churning. "I'm fine as I am." She prayed her refusal would be enough to deter him, but the look in his eyes told her otherwise. His expression darkened, the false friendliness slipping away like a mask revealing the cruel intentions beneath. "Think it over," he said, his tone now cold and threatening. "It would be such a pity if we had to let you go. You know how hard it is to find work around here." For the rest of the day, Elena did everything she could to avoid Don Carlos. She kept her head down, focused on her work, but inside she was a storm of fear and anxiety. What would she do if he made good on his threat? How could she protect her job and keep her son safe? The worry gnawed at her, but there was no time to dwell. She had to keep going, no matter how scared she felt. During her break, Elena slipped outside and pulled the necklace from her pocket, staring at it as though it could offer her some kind of guidance. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a connection to her mother, a symbol of the strength and dignity that had been passed down through generations of women who had survived despite the odds. As she clutched the necklace in her hand, Elena felt a flicker of that strength return to her. She would fight just as her mother had before her. When she finally returned home that evening, she found her son looking a little better, though still weak. Relief washed over her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that their struggles were far from over. "Mama," Ricardito said, his voice soft and innocent, "why do you work so much?" Elena's heart ached at his question, the simplicity of it a stark contrast to the complicated web of hardship that bound their lives. She knelt beside him and pulled him into her arms, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "So you can have a better future, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "So you don't have to work as hard as Mama does." That night, after Ricardito had fallen asleep, Elena sat alone in the dim light of their small apartment. She counted the little money she had left, her heart sinking as she realized how little it was. The debt to Don Ramon weighed on her like a mountain, growing larger with each passing day. The thought of selling her mother's necklace crossed her mind again, but as her fingers traced the familiar contours of the pendant, the memories of her mother's strength anchored her. "I promise, Mama," she whispered into the stillness, "I'll keep fighting. For Ricardito, for you, for me." Outside, the city slept, unaware of the silent battle raging within that modest apartment. Exhausted but resolute, Elena lay down beside her son, knowing that tomorrow would bring another round of struggles. She steeled herself for the fight, determined to keep alive the fragile hope of a better life for her child. The days blurred into weeks, each one a desperate race against time. Elena rose before dawn every morning, quietly preparing breakfast for her son before rushing off to the factory. Don Carlos' eyes had grown more persistent, his glances more brazen, each one a reminder of the precariousness of her situation. Every day was a tightrope walk, balancing the need to keep her job against the terror of what she might lose if she refused his advances. One afternoon, while cleaning in Dona Mercedes' grand house, Elena overheard a conversation that sent a chill down her spine. "Did you hear about the raid in the neighborhood?" Dona Mercedes was saying to a friend, her voice dripping with casual indifference. "The authorities are taking the children of single mothers and putting them in orphanages. It's supposed to be for their own good, or so they say." Elena's heart raced, her hands trembling as she continued to scrub the floor. The thought of losing her son, of having him ripped away from her, was unbearable. That night, she held Ricardito close, her arms wrapped tightly around him, as though she could shield him from the world's cruelty. "I'll protect you," she whispered fiercely into his hair. "No one will take you away from me." Meanwhile, the debt to Don Ramon loomed larger than ever, a constant shadow over her life. The moneylender's thugs began showing up at her door, their threats thinly veiled in ominous smiles. "Remember, Elena," one of them said with a menacing grin, "Don Ramon always collects his debts, one way or another." Desperate to make ends meet, Elena took on a night job at a local bar. The nights were long and grueling, the patrons often drunk and disrespectful, but every tip she earned brought her a little closer to paying off her debt. The work was exhausting, but Elena pushed through it, driven by the fierce determination to protect her son and keep their fragile hopes alive. Each night, as she returned home, the weight of her burdens pressed down on her, but Elena refused to break. For Ricardito, for her mother's memory, for the promise of a better future, she would fight, no matter how long the battle lasted. The world outside might have been indifferent to her suffering, but within the walls of her small apartment, Elena was a warrior. facing every challenge with a heart full of love and a spirit that refused to be crushed. One evening, Elena dragged her weary body home after another grueling day, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fatigue and worry. But as she approached her building, she saw a small figure sitting on the cold concrete steps. It was Ricardito, her precious boy, and to her horror, he was holding out small packs of gum to strangers passing by. Shock and disbelief froze her in place for a moment. "What are you doing here, my amor?" she asked, her voice cracking with a mixture of surprise and sorrow. The boy looked up at her, his small face full of a determination that seemed too big for his age. "I want to help you, Mama," he said earnestly. "I know you work hard for me. I want to do my part." His words, filled with innocence and love, shattered something deep inside her. Elena dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him, the tears she had tried to hold back for so long finally spilling over. She cried silently, her tears soaking into his shirt, as guilt gnawed at her heart. What kind of life was this? What kind of mother was she, that her child felt the need to shoulder the burden of survival alongside her? That night, as Ricardito slept peacefully, unaware of the torment inside her, Elena sat by the dim light of the moon, clutching the necklace once again. She held it in her hands, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the memories it held. The gems sparkled faintly, each one a relic of a life that seemed like a distant dream now, a life where hope had once flourished, where promises had been made that she could no longer keep. "What should I do, Mama?" she whispered into the quiet night, as if the necklace could somehow speak the wisdom she so desperately needed. But the silence only deepened the ache in her heart. It was then that the unthinkable began to take shape in her mind, a decision that tore at her very soul. With trembling hands, she rifled through old papers until she found a small, tattered card with the name and number of an adoption agency. Someone had given it to her long ago, and she had shoved it away, never imagining she would ever need it. Now, it felt like a lifeline, but one that would break her heart in two. She held the card in her hands, staring at it through a blur of tears. "Forgive me, my sweet child," she sobbed silently, her gaze drifting to where Ricardito slept soundly. "Maybe this is the only way I can give you the life you deserve. Maybe this is love, even if it means letting you go." The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a boulder, making it hard to breathe. But she knew in her heart that sometimes love required the hardest sacrifices. Morning came, but it did not bring the usual lightness of a new day. Every movement felt heavy, every breath labored, as if the air itself was thick with sorrow. Ricardito, blissfully unaware of the agony in his mother's heart, sat at the small table, eating his breakfast with a bright smile. He chattered away about his plans for school, his words innocent and carefree, piercing Elena's heart with every syllable. She watched him as if she were memorizing him, his tousled hair that refused to stay neat, the little milk stain on his upper lip that he hadn't noticed, the pure, untainted joy in his eyes. Each detail felt like a dagger, a reminder of what she was about to lose. "Ricardito, mi amor," Elena said, her voice strained with the effort of keeping herself composed. "Today you're not going to school. We're going somewhere special." Her words trembled on the edge of breaking, but she forced herself to smile for him, even though it didn't reach her eyes. Ricardito's face lit up with excitement. "Where are we going, Mama?" he asked, his curiosity bubbling over. "It's a surprise," Elena replied, her heart shattering with every word. She held his hand tightly as they walked, each step taking her closer to the edge of an emotional abyss. Ricardito, unaware of the gravity of the day, skipped along beside her, laughing and chattering, while Elena's heart grew heavier with every step. The adoption agency loomed in the distance, a place that symbolized both hope and despair. When they finally reached the building, Elena's feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn around, to take her son and run far away, but she stood frozen in place, her hand still clasped around Ricardito's tiny fingers. "What's wrong, Mama?" he asked, noticing her tears for the first time. "Why are you crying?" Elena knelt down in front of him, cupping his sweet face in her hands, her thumbs gently brushing away the tears that she could no longer hold back. "My child, my life," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I need you to know that I love you more than anything in this world. Everything I do is because I love you." Her words trembled with the weight of the truth she couldn't bring herself to speak. Ricardito, sensing his mother's distress but not fully understanding it, wrapped his arms around her. "I love you too, Mama," he said softly, trying to comfort her in the only way he knew how. At that moment, a woman from the agency stepped outside to greet them. She smiled politely, but the smile faltered when she saw the pain etched into Elena's face. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with concern. Elena's eyes drifted from the woman to the imposing building behind her, the place that held the future she couldn't give her son. With her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces, she nodded, unable to speak. And so, with one final, lingering look at her son, Elena made the choice that no mother should ever have to make. The weight of that choice would haunt her forever, but she hoped that it was the ultimate act of love. "Ricardito," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she fought to keep it steady. "You're going to stay here for a little while. These people, they will take good care of you." She tried to force a smile, but her lips refused to cooperate. Inside, her heart was crumbling into pieces, but she couldn't let him see it. She had to stay strong for him. The boy's face, once filled with innocent curiosity, now clouded with fear. His small hand clung tightly to hers. "But what about you, Mama?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. She swallowed hard, willing herself not to break down in front of him. "I'll come back for you, my love," she lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I promise." The agency woman gently took Ricardito's hand, leading him toward the building that now stood as a barrier between them. As the door began to close behind them, Elena felt a part of her soul slip away with him. Desperately, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the necklace that had once been her mother's, her last link to her past. With trembling fingers, she placed it in his small backpack. "So you'll always have a piece of me with you," she whispered, though she knew he could no longer hear her. The door shut with a soft but final thud, sealing her fate. Elena stood frozen, her feet glued to the cold pavement as if they belonged to someone else. The world around her blurred, fading into a distant hum as the reality of what she had done sank in. Her vision grew hazy with tears, and she collapsed onto the sidewalk, no longer able to contain the grief that had been building inside her. She sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of her sorrow, oblivious to the curious stares of those who passed by. In that moment of utter despair, Elena made a vow, a promise born out of the deepest love and the darkest desperation. She would do anything to be reunited with her son. Even if it took a lifetime, she would find a way to bring him back to her. The years that followed were nothing short of brutal. Each day without Ricardito was a sharp knife twisting in her chest, a wound that refused to heal. Elena worked herself to the bone, taking on every job she could find, scraping together every peso she could save. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and worn, her body thin from long hours and little rest. But she never stopped. The hope of one day offering her son the life he deserved was the only thing that kept her going. One dreary afternoon, while cleaning a grand home for a wealthy family, Elena stumbled upon a photograph that stole the breath from her lungs. It was a simple picture, tucked into the corner of a shelf, but it was enough to make her world stop. In the photo, a teenage boy stood smiling with his adoptive parents. Though years had passed, she would recognize those eyes anywhere those were the eyes of her little Ricardito. Her hands shook as she carefully turned the photo over, her heart pounding in her chest. Ricardo Montero, 15 years old, she read in a barely audible whisper. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. After all these years of searching, hoping, praying, at last, she had a lead on her son. That night, in the solitude of her small, dimly lit room, Elena wept tears of both joy and anguish. Her child, her precious child, was alive. He was out there, growing, thriving. The thought filled her with a bittersweet ache. But along with the joy came a new pain, the reality that he was so far away from her, living a life she had never been a part of. The life she had always wanted to give him, but couldn't. She wrestled with the desire to rush to him, to hold him close and never let go again, and the fear that doing so would shatter the new life he had built without her. The days that followed were torture, each one a battle between hope and fear. Elena discreetly gathered every scrap of information she could about Ricardo's life, learning that the Montero family was one of the most influential in the city. They owned several properties and businesses, their wealth and power far beyond anything Elena could ever have imagined. The more she learned, the more conflicted she became. Could she really risk disrupting the life he now had, a life filled with opportunities she could never have provided? One afternoon, after much agonizing, Elena found herself standing in front of the Montero family's mansion. It was a grand, imposing structure, a symbol of the wealth and privilege her son now belonged to. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding in her chest, imagining the life of luxury Ricardo must now be living. The contrast between this world and the one she had left him in was stark and cruel. Just as she was about to turn away, her resolve crumbling, the door to the mansion opened. A young man stepped outside, and Elena's heart stopped. It was Ricardo. Her breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight of him, now tall and confident, with the poise of someone who had been given everything. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Elena's world seemed to hang in the balance. But then, just as quickly, Ricardo looked away and walked past her without a second glance, without recognizing the woman who had given everything for him. That night, in the quiet loneliness of her modest room, Elena gently pulled out an old, faded photograph of Ricardo from beneath a pile of worn letters. Her hands shook as she held it up to the dim light, her eyes tracing the familiar features of the child she had once cradled so tenderly. The photo showed a boy with wide, innocent eyes, a soft smile that could brighten any room. Her thoughts drifted back to the young man she had seen that day, the confident stranger who had passed her by without a second glance. They were the same person, yet the years had molded them into two entirely different beings. The boy in the photograph, so full of warmth and hope, was now a man hardened by the life she had chosen for him. "Did I do the right thing?" Elena whispered into the empty room, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. The question had haunted her for years, but seeing him now, so distant and unrecognizable, brought it to the forefront of her mind like never before. The doubt gnawed at her, twisting her heart in knots. Should she approach him? Could she risk shattering the life he had built, a life she had never been a part of? Did she even have the right to disrupt the fragile balance of his world after all these years? Elena spent that long, sleepless night staring at the photograph, her mind torn between a mother's boundless love and the fear of destroying the very thing she had sacrificed everything to protect. The hours dragged on, each one adding another layer of uncertainty. But as dawn began to creep through the curtains, she made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She would not reveal herself to Ricardo. She could not bring herself to disturb the life he had built without her. But she would find a way to be close, to watch over him from the shadows, to care for him without ever crossing the line between their worlds. "I promise you, my child," she whispered to the photograph, her tears falling softly onto the worn edges. "Even if you never know who I am, I will always be there, watching over you." With that promise etched into her heart, Elena began to plan. She would find a way to be a silent guardian, always near but never seen, guarding her secret like the most precious and painful of treasures. Time, however, marched forward with its usual relentless cruelty. As the years passed, Elena's once dark hair turned silver, and her hands, worn from years of labor, became rough and calloused. She had become an almost invisible figure in the world of the Montero family. She had secured a job as a gardener at a nearby property, a role that allowed her to observe Ricardo's life from a distance, her presence unnoticed but constant. Every morning, as she trimmed the hedges and pruned the roses, she would see her son leaving for the day, dressed in elegant suits, his face set in a determined expression as he hurried off to important meetings. Elena's heart swelled with pride at what he had become: a successful, confident man, but that pride was always tinged with sorrow. What had become of her sweet Ricardito, the little boy who had once sold gum on the steps to help his mother? Now, he was a stranger in a world she could only observe from afar. One day, as she worked quietly in the garden, Elena overheard a conversation that sent chills down her spine. Ricardo was in the neighboring mansion's garden, his voice raised in anger as he argued with his adoptive father, Mr. Montero. "You can't keep doing this, Ricardo, Mr." Montero's voice was sharp with frustration. "Your decisions are destroying the company. Don't you care about the legacy of this family? Is this how you repay everything we've done for you?" Ricardo's response was filled with bitterness, a tone Elena had never imagined hearing from him. "Legacy," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "All you've ever taught me is how to be cruel and greedy. Is that the legacy you want me to continue?" Elena stood frozen behind a large bush, her heart pounding in her chest. What had happened to her sweet boy? How had he become this cold, calculating man, obsessed with power and money? The conversation continued, revealing a side of Ricardo she had never known, a side that filled her with both fear and heartbreak. That night, in the solitude of her small room, Elena cried bitterly, the tears flowing freely as the weight of her decisions pressed down on her like never before. Had giving him up for adoption turned him into this man, so far removed from the loving child she remembered? Was this her fault? The following days were agonizing for Elena. Every time she caught a glimpse of Ricardo, she desperately searched his face for any trace of the boy he once was, but all she found was a man consumed by ambition and coldness. The warmth and innocence she had once known seemed lost, buried beneath layers of wealth and power. One afternoon, as Ricardo inspected the property where she worked, he passed by Elena without even acknowledging her presence. Unable to contain the emotions that had been building up inside her, she spoke up, her voice trembling. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her words shaking with both fear and desperation. "May I say something?" Ricardo turned to her with a look of indifference, his eyes devoid of recognition. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone cold and dismissive. Elena swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I just wanted to tell you that life is about more than money and power. Sometimes love and compassion are worth more than any fortune." For a brief moment, something flickered in Ricardo's gaze, something that reminded her of the boy she once knew. But just as quickly, he pushed it aside, his expression hardening once again. "Save your advice, woman," he replied curtly. "You know nothing about my life." As she watched him walk away, Elena felt her heart break all over again. How could she reach him? How could she show him the path of love and compassion that she had always wanted for him? The distance between them felt wider than ever, and yet she couldn't give up. She couldn't let him slip away entirely, not when there was still a chance, no matter how small, that she could bring him back to the light. With tears in her eyes, Elena made a new vow. No matter how long it took, she would find a way to remind Ricardo of who he truly was. Even if it meant revealing the truth she had kept hidden for so many painful years, she would do whatever it took to reach him. She could no longer stand idly by as he drifted further into a life she had never wanted for him. Autumn descended upon the city, painting the trees with shades of gold and crimson. The crisp air carried with it the scent of change, but for Elena, Every day felt heavier than the last. Her body grew more tired with each passing year, but still, she worked tirelessly in the gardens near the Montero mansion, her heart wrestling with the fear of revealing the truth and the hope that, somehow, she could still save her son. On a bitterly cold morning, while Elena swept the crisp, fallen leaves from the garden path, her breath clouding in the chilly air, she noticed an elegant woman stepping out of a sleek car and walking towards the Montero mansion. It was Sofia, Ricardo's wife, and as Elena's eyes followed her, she couldn't help but feel a pang of curiosity. There was something about the way Sofia moved, the tension in her posture, the way her gaze lingered on the garden as if searching for something beyond the walls of her opulent life. For a brief moment, their eyes met, an unspoken connection that lingered in the cold air between them. Elena felt as if Sofia was on the verge of saying something, as if she could sense Elena's presence in more ways than one. But then, just as quickly, Sofia turned away, disappearing into the grand house, leaving Elena with a growing sense of unease gnawing at her heart. Days passed, but the memory of that fleeting exchange stayed with Elena. Then, one afternoon, while tending to the garden, she overheard a conversation that sent a chill down her spine. Ricardo and Sofia were arguing in the garden, their voices filled with the weight of unspoken pain. "You can't keep doing this," Ricardo Sofia said, her tone laced with concern and desperation. "You're pushing away everyone who cares about you. What happened to the man I fell in love with?" Ricardo's reply was as cold as the winter air. "That man was weak," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The business world doesn't forgive weakness." But at what cost? Sofia's voice trembled with emotion. "You're losing your humanity, Ricardo. You're becoming someone I don't recognize." Elena's heart clenched as she listened to these words, her own memories colliding with the harsh reality before her. What had happened to her sweet Ricardo, the boy who once sold gum on the stairs to help his mother? How had he become this distant, hardened man, consumed by the relentless pursuit of power and success? The questions haunted her, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her chest like a stone. That night, sleep eluded Elena. The image of her son lost in a world of cold ambition played over and over in her mind. Unable to bear the silence any longer, she reached for the old photo album she kept hidden away, her most precious treasure. As she turned the brittle pages, her eyes fell on the familiar face of little Ricardo, smiling brightly, his eyes full of life and innocence. How could she bring that boy back? How could she make Ricardo remember the love and joy that had once filled his heart? With a deep breath, Elena made a decision. She could no longer stand by and watch her son lose himself in this world of coldness. She needed to reach out to him, to remind him of who he truly was. Grabbing a piece of paper, she began to write. Her hands trembled as she recounted the story of a mother who had been forced to give her son up for adoption, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved him so much that she wanted to give him a better life. She poured her heart into the letter, writing about the unconditional love that had never faded, not even for a moment, and the hope that one day, fate would bring them back together. She didn't reveal who she was, but she hoped that the words would touch something deep within Ricardo, something he had long forgotten. The next morning, with her heart pounding in her chest, Elena slipped the letter into the Montero family's mailbox. Every step away from that house felt like a weight lifting and crashing back down at the same time. She knew she was risking everything, exposing her secret, disrupting the life Ricardo had built, but she couldn't bear to watch him lose himself any longer. As she walked away, she looked back toward the mansion, her gaze drifting up to one of the windows. For a moment, she thought she saw Ricardo standing there, staring out with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it possible that, on some level, he felt the invisible thread that still connected them? Elena returned to her small room, the quiet walls now echoing with the uncertainty of what she had done. She sat down by the window, gazing out at the world beyond, her heart heavy with both hope and fear. All she could do now was wait, her soul praying that her words would find their way into her son's heart. She had done all she could now. She had to trust in the power of a mother's love, a force that she hoped could transcend the years, the distance, and the barriers that had been built between them. The days that followed were pure torment for Elena. Every creak of the garden gate, every footstep echoing on the street, sent her heart racing with anticipation. She waited anxiously for any sign, any response to the letter she had poured her soul into. But there was only silence. Life at the Montero mansion carried on as though nothing had changed. The painful possibility that her words had gone unread, that her desperate plea had fallen into the void, gnawed at her relentlessly. Each day blurred into the next, filled with the agony of waiting, of wondering. Then, a week later, something shifted. While Elena was tending to the garden, she noticed Ricardo leaving the house, as he did every morning. But this time, instead of heading directly to his car, he paused at the edge of the driveway. His eyes roamed the garden, lingering on the flowers she had so carefully tended. And then, for a brief moment, his gaze rested on her. Elena's breath caught in her throat. It seemed as though he might say something, as though he was on the verge of acknowledging her presence. But then, just as quickly, he shook his head, and the moment passed. He got into his car and drove away, leaving Elena standing there, a tangle of hope and despair in her chest. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Sophia appeared in the garden. Her approach was hesitant, her expression one of curiosity mixed with caution. She moved toward Elena with slow, deliberate steps, her eyes scanning the older woman's face, as if searching for something. "Excuse me," Sophia said softly, her voice carrying both kindness and a hint of uncertainty. "Have you been working here for a long time?" Elena nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she feared Sophia might hear it. "Yes, I am," she replied quietly. "Many years." Sophia hesitated, biting her lip as if choosing her next words carefully. "By any chance, did you leave a letter in our mailbox last week?" Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The question hung in the air like a weight pressing down on her. With a trembling voice, she answered, "Yes, that was me." Sophia's expression shifted, a storm of emotions passing through her eyes: compassion, confusion, perhaps even understanding. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you?" Elena could no longer hold back the flood of emotions that had been building inside her for so long. Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Yes, I'm Ricardo's mother. I had to give him up for adoption so many years ago. I thought it was the only way to give him a better life." Sophia's gaze softened, her expression filled with a mixture of sympathy and shock. "Ricardo, read your letter," she said gently. "He's been different since then, more reflective, more human." Elena's heart leapt at Sophia's words. A flicker of hope sparked within her, fragile but real. "Does he know I'm here?" she asked, her voice tinged with both fear and anticipation. Sophia shook her head. "No, not yet. He's struggling with his emotions. But I think he needs to know the full truth. He needs answers." Just then, the familiar sound of an approaching car broke the quiet. Ricardo was returning home, earlier than usual. Panic surged through Elena. She wasn't ready, not yet. "Please," she whispered urgently, her eyes pleading with Sophia. "Don't tell him you saw me. I need to be the one to speak with him. I need to do this right." Sophia nodded, a look of understanding in her eyes. "I won't say anything," she promised. "But don't wait too long. Ricardo needs closure, and you both deserve the truth." As Sophia walked back to the house, Elena stood rooted in place, trembling. Through the window, she watched as Ricardo entered the house. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Elena felt something stir deep inside her. This time, there was no quick dismissal, no indifferent glance. For the first time in years, she felt as though her son truly saw her. The connection she had longed for seemed within reach, if only for a fleeting moment. That night, alone in her small room, Elena couldn't sleep. The weight of what was to come pressed heavily on her chest. Tomorrow, she would face her son. She would reveal the truth that had been buried for so long, no matter the consequences. She had lived in the shadows for too many years, watching from afar as her son grew into a man. Now, it was time to step into the light. With a heart full of fear and hope, Elena prepared herself for the moment that would change everything for both of them. Morning broke with a tension that clung to the air like an impending storm. The chill in the atmosphere seemed to seep into Elena's bones as she slowly prepared herself for the day. This day, however, was unlike any other. With trembling hands, she carefully selected her best blouse, the one she had tucked away for special occasions, though such days had become rare in her life. It wasn't extravagant, just a simple, well-kept blouse that made her feel just a little more dignified. As she buttoned it, her fingers fumbled, her nerves getting the better of her. She took a deep breath and moved to the mirror, combing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes, preparing herself for the moment she had imagined for decades. Her reflection stared back at her, a face lined with age and worry, yet beneath the weariness, there was a flicker of something stronger: hope. She allowed herself to embrace that hope, if only for a moment, before gathering her things and stepping outside into the cold morning air. The walk to the Montero mansion felt longer than usual, each step weighted with the anticipation of what was to come. Her heart thudded in her chest as she arrived at the garden earlier than usual. She needed to be there, needed to be ready. The hours passed painfully slow, each tick of the clock dragging her deeper into a state of anxious waiting. Every noise, a distant car horn, the rustle of leaves in the wind, made her jump. Her breath caught every time she heard the door open, but each time it was not Ricardo. She swallowed her disappointment and waited, her heart in her throat, until finally near noon the moment came. She saw Ricardo emerge from the house, his usual confident stride slightly slower, as if he too was feeling the weight of something more. Elena's pulse quickened, her palms damp with nervousness as she summoned all the courage she had left. She stepped forward, her feet moving of their own accord, and called out softly, "Mr. Ricardo, could I speak with you for a moment?" He stopped, turning toward her with a look of curiosity tinged with wariness. There was something softer in his expression than usual, a gentleness that took her by surprise. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice lacking the usual sharpness. Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she was about to say. "It's about the letter you received last week," she began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. Ricardo's eyes widened in shock, the pieces quickly falling into place. He started to ask, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. His gaze bore into her, searching for answers she had long held back. "Yes," Elena confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wrote that letter. Ricardito, I am your mother." The silence that followed was crushing, as though the world itself had paused to listen. Ricardo stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief, confusion, and anger. Yet there was something else, something deeper, that she couldn't quite place, perhaps a fear of the truth, or perhaps a fear of what that truth would mean for his carefully constructed life. "No," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling as he took a step back. "This can't be true." "It is," Elena replied, tears pooling in her eyes. "The Monteros adopted you when you were 10 years old. I had to give you up. I was young, poor, and I couldn't give you the life you deserved." Ricardo's face paled as if the words had physically struck him. He took another step back, as if retreating from a truth that was too painful to confront. "Why now?" he asked, his voice rising with a mix of anger and hurt. "Why after all these years?" Elena extended a trembling hand toward him, but stopped herself before touching him. She wanted so desperately to comfort him. to explain everything, but she knew that her words alone might not be enough. "I've been close all this time," she said softly. "I've been watching over you from afar. But when I saw what you were becoming, I couldn't stay silent any longer." Ricardo's expression hardened, his defenses quickly rising. "What I was becoming," he repeated, his voice cold. "What do you know about me?" "I know," Elena replied, her voice barely audible. "I know that you're not happy. I know that there's still goodness in you, the goodness of the boy you once were." Ricardo's gaze softened momentarily, a flicker of the child he had once been visible beneath the mask of indifference he had worn for so long. But the moment passed, and he quickly turned away, retreating back into himself. Without another word, he walked quickly back toward the house, leaving Elena standing there, frozen in place. She watched him go, her heart aching with the weight of what had just transpired. But even amidst the pain, there was a spark of hope. The truth had been spoken, and now all she could do was wait, and hope that love could find a way through the walls Ricardo had built around his heart. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for Elena. Each morning, she arrived at the garden with her heart in her throat, hoping to catch another glimpse of Ricardo, yearning for another chance to speak with him. But it seemed as though he had disappeared. His absence was palpable, a heavy weight that hung over the estate, turning the garden into a place of quiet desperation. Elena went through the motions of her work, but her mind was always elsewhere, lost in thoughts of what could have been, of what might still be. One afternoon, while pruning the roses, Elena heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Sofia approaching, her face etched with worry. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and Elena felt a pang of guilt knowing she had contributed to the turmoil within the Montero household. "Elena," Sofia said gently, her voice laced with concern. "Ricardo, he hasn't been well since he found out the truth." Elena's heart sank. "Is he very angry?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, fearing the answer. Sofia shook her head. "It's not anger, exactly. It's confusion. He's questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. He barely eats, barely sleeps. He spends hours in his study, just staring at old photographs. I've never seen him like this before." Elena felt the tears threatening to spill over once again. "I never meant to cause him pain," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I only wanted to help him, to save him from losing himself." "I know," Sofia replied softly, placing a comforting hand on Elena's arm. "And I think deep down Ricardo knows that too. But he needs time. He needs to come to terms with everything on his own." As they spoke, neither of them realized that Ricardo was watching from the window of his study. His gaze flicked between the two women, the mother who had given him life and the wife who had stood by his side, and for the first time, he began to see the threads that connected them all. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, memories, and questions that had no easy answers. That night, sleep once again eluded Elena. Unable to bear the silence, she left her small room and wandered the streets in the cold night air. Her feet carried her on an unfamiliar path, but when she finally looked up, she found herself standing in front of the Montero mansion. The large iron gate loomed before her, and beyond it, the house glowed with soft, warm light. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what had led her there, when she noticed a figure moving in the garden. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized it was Ricardo. They stood there, separated by the gate, but bound by something much deeper, an invisible thread that transcended time and circumstance. Elena's heart raced, her chest tight with anticipation as she waited, afraid to break the fragile moment. Finally, Ricardo's voice broke the silence, his words barely audible in the stillness of the night. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw with vulnerability. "Why did you never look for me before?" The softness in his tone contrasted sharply with the hardness she had come to associate with him, and Elena felt her heart crack open. She had never heard him sound so lost, so hurt. "I tried," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I tried so many times, but I was afraid. Afraid of ruining the life you had built. Afraid that you would hate me for abandoning you." Ricardo stood in silence, the weight of her words settling over him. He closed his eyes for a long moment, as if trying to absorb the truth she had shared. When he opened them again, the distance between them seemed both vast and narrow, an unbridgeable chasm in a single step all at once. Without saying another word, Ricardo turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Elena standing in the cold, a mix of pain and hope swirling in her chest. As she made her way back to her small room, she realized that this was only the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward reconciliation. But for the first time in years, she felt that there was a real possibility of reuniting with her son. Autumn slowly surrendered to winter, and with it came a cold that seemed to penetrate to the very bone. Elena continued her daily routine in the garden, though now every task was imbued with a heightened awareness. She knew Ricardo was watching her, sometimes from the window of his study, sometimes from the terrace, but he never approached. The distance between them remained, but it was no longer an unbreakable barrier. It was a tentative space, filled with the possibility of something more. One particularly frigid morning, Elena arrived at the garden to find a surprise waiting for her. On the bench where she usually rested, there was a box, neatly wrapped with a simple ribbon. Her heart raced as she approached it, her hands trembling as she carefully untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside, she found a new coat, thick and warm, made of high-quality material. There was no note, but Elena knew who had sent it. Tears welled in her eyes as she gently ran her fingers over the soft fabric. As she slipped the coat on, savoring the warmth it provided, she saw Sophia approaching from the house, a small smile playing on her lips. "It was Ricardo's idea," Sophia said, her voice soft with understanding. "He said he couldn't let his mother freeze." Elena's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a balm to her soul, soothing the deep wounds that had festered for so long. It was the first time Ricardo had acknowledged her as his mother, even if indirectly. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. "He's struggling." Elena Sophia continued, her voice tinged with concern. "Part of him wants to get closer to you, to know you. But another part is terrified. He's afraid that if he lets you in, he'll lose you all over again." Elena nodded, understanding the conflict within her son. She had felt that same fear, the same hesitation, all those years ago. "I'll wait," she said with quiet determination. "I'll wait as long as it takes." That afternoon, as Elena carefully tended to the roses, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Ricardo standing a few meters away, his face a mixture of conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, but also something softer, something closer to acceptance. "The coat," Elena began to say, but Ricardo interrupted her, his voice strained with emotion. "I don't want you to get sick," he said brusquely, avoiding her gaze. After a brief pause, he added, his voice quieter, "I remember the necklace. The one you gave me when you left me. I lost it years ago on a business trip. I've never felt so devastated by losing an object." Elena's heart broke and healed at the same time. The necklace had been the last tangible connection to her, a symbol of the bond that had never truly been severed. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him everything, but she knew she had to be patient. "It was your grandmother's," Elena explained softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I gave it to you so you would always have a part of your family with you." Ricardo looked at her then, his eyes filled with a pain that she had never seen in him before. "Why?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you give me up for adoption?" Elena took a deep breath, knowing that this moment was crucial. She had to choose her words carefully to make him understand the depth of her love and the impossible choices she had faced. I gave you up for adoption because I loved you too much to keep you in a life of poverty and suffering," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I wanted you to have opportunities that I couldn't give you. I wanted you to have a chance at a better life." Ricardo closed his eyes as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. When he opened them again, Elena saw a flicker of the boy he once was, the child she had held in her arms all those years ago. "I need time," he finally said, his voice trembling with the enormity of it all. "I need to process this, to figure out what it all means." Elena watched him walk away, her heart heavy, but filled with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. Something had shifted between them. A door that had once been firmly closed was now, at least, ajar. And for now, that was enough to keep the spark of hope alive. Spring slowly arrived, bringing with it new buds and blossoms in the garden. And with the change in seasons came a subtle shift in the atmosphere at the Montero mansion. Elena noticed that Ricardo spent more time at home, often lingering on the terrace, watching her as she worked in the garden. There was still distance between them, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Instead, it was a space filled with potential, with the possibility of something new growing between them. One morning, while Elena was planting new flowers, Ricardo approached her. His steps were hesitant but determined, as if he had finally made a decision he had been wrestling with for days. I'd like you to tell me about my childhood," he said, his voice a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. "Of course," she replied with a trembling smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "What would you like to know?" Ricardo gestured toward a nearby bench, and they both sat down together, the tension between them slowly easing. Everything he said simply, his eyes filled with a longing she hadn't seen before. For the next few hours, Elena shared stories from Ricardo's early years, the moments that had shaped him, the memories that had sustained her through all the years of separation. She told him about how she used to sing him to sleep with lullabies, how his first word had filled her with pride, how his laughter had once been the light of her life. With each story, Ricardo seemed to soften, as though the walls he had built around himself were slowly crumbling away. At one point, Ricardo's face grew distant as he seemed to recall a memory long buried. "I remember a park," he said quietly. "There was a swing. You would push me, and I felt like I could touch the sky." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "The Oak Park," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "We went there every Sunday. It was our little escape from everything." Ricardo looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, grief, longing, but also understanding. "Why didn't you fight harder for me?" he asked, his voice tinged with pain. Elena felt the question hit her like a dagger to the heart. She had asked herself that same question 1,000 times over the years. "I did, Ricardo," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I fought with everything I had, but the poverty, the debts, the threats. I was young, and I was scared. I thought giving you up was the only way to save you." Ricardo remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ground as he processed her words. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "My whole life I felt like something was missing, like a piece of me was lost. Now I understand why." As the wind picked up, scattering leaves around them, Sophia appeared on the terrace, watching the scene unfold with a mix of surprise and relief. Ricardo glanced at her before turning back to Elena. "I need time to take this all in," he said, standing up and looking down at her with a softness that hadn't been there before. "But thank you for telling me, for being here." As Ricardo walked away, Elena felt a mixture of sadness and hope swirling within her. She knew that the road to reconciliation would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, she felt that it was possible. Sophia approached Elena, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's a start," Sophia said softly, her eyes filled with warmth. "A good start. Elena nodded, her gaze following Ricardo as he disappeared into the house. A start, she repeated, her voice filled with a quiet determination. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream of a future where she and Ricardo could be a family again. The days turned into weeks, and Elena noticed subtle but significant changes in Ricardo. He was no longer the cold, distant man he had once been. There were moments when she caught him watching her with a thoughtful expression, as if he were trying to reconcile the image of the elderly gardener with the fragmented memories of his childhood. One afternoon, as Elena carefully pruned the roses, Ricardo approached with a photo album in his hands. He seemed hesitant, as if unsure of how to begin. "I found this in the attic," he said quietly, his voice soft and introspective. "They're photos of me as a child right after the adoption. I thought you might want to see them." Elena's heart skipped a beat as she reached out to take the album from him, her hands trembling slightly. As she flipped through the pages, she saw her little Ricardito growing up before her eyes: birthday parties, trips to the beach, school graduations. Each photo was a glimpse into a life she had missed, a life she had only ever imagined from afar. "You were such a happy child," Elena murmured, tears blurring her vision as she traced the lines of his smiling face in each photograph. Ricardo sat beside her, his gaze distant as he, too, looked at the images of his younger self. He admitted softly. "My adoptive parents gave me a lot of love." Elena felt a pang of pain at his words, but she forced herself to smile through the tears. "I'm glad," she said quietly. "That's all I ever wanted for you." Ricardo looked at her then, his eyes filled with an emotion Elena couldn't quite decipher. "But I always felt like something was missing," he continued quietly. "Now I understand what it was." At that moment, a gust of wind blew through the garden, scattering a few leaves across the ground. One of them, delicate and golden, landed gently on the photo album. Ricardo picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "I remember," he said slowly, his voice distant, "a song you used to sing to me. Something about autumn leaves." Elena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the memory he was reaching for. "The little autumn leaves," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "It was your favorite lullaby." Without thinking, Elena began to hum the melody softly, the familiar tune filling the air between them. To her surprise, Ricardo closed his eyes, a look of peace settling over his features. When the song ended, he opened his eyes, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. As Ricardo stood to leave, he hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on Elena. "Elena, Mom," he said the word cautiously, as if testing its weight, "I'd like you to come to dinner with us tonight. Sophia and we want to get to know you better." Elena felt her heart swell with a joy she hadn't experienced in decades. The word Mom hung in the air, filling the space between them with a warmth she had long forgotten. "I'd love to," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. As Ricardo walked away, Elena looked down at the photo album in her hands and then up at the figure of her grown son. For the first time in many years, she felt the emptiness in her heart begin to fill. The road to reconciliation would still be long, but now, more than ever, Elena had hope for the future. What have you learned from Elena's story so far? Life is filled with difficult choices, and sometimes love requires sacrifices that we never thought we'd have to make. But through it all, hope and compassion can guide us back to the connections that matter most. Please comment below with one thing you've learned from this story and how you plan to bring it into practice in your own life. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.